Before the pandemic, we were engaged in a lively conversation about the future of urban mobility. The reopening of the economies provides us with a timely opportunity to revisit this topic. There is no question that the global crisis of the past 18 months has hit transportation particularly hard. But as we have repeatedly observed, disruption follows periods of crisis as we reimagine established norms and practices. For example, we enter the post-pandemic period with three new realities we will need to consider as we reimagine mobility. First, a significant percent of employees and employers are adopting hybrid work. This will result in different commuting patterns. Second, particularly in the US, we're starting to see a redistribution of urban populations to suburbs, as is happening in the Bay Area and New York City, and to second-tier cities, Nashville and Austin being good examples. This will have longer-term implications to public transportation and to, obviously, real estate. Third, companies are starting to rethink business travel. This is not will only impact airline travel, and airlines are already starting to admit that, but all associated transportation. So when we talk about disruption, we tend to think about changes caused by technology and business model innovations. And particularly venture investors like myself tend to gravitate towards the technology innovations as a means of creating change. But over the past decade, the goal of the efforts around autonomous vehicles and on-demand mobility services was to innovate through new technology and business models. In my book, Transportation Transformation, I argue that cities must take a leadership role in ushering new mobility and shaping the impact of urban environment. In doing so, they must approach urban mobility as a system whose realization and efficient operation requires the collaboration of cities, automakers, and mobility services companies. And as they collaborate, these three constituencies will need to make certain decisions that will require them to transform in specific ways. When they implement this transportation successfully, a new mobility system will emerge, and this will give rise to new forms of value and value exchange models. So today I want to talk about these transformations, the value chains that will emerge, and the forms of value that they will rely on. But in order to understand where we need to go, it is important to consider where we will be coming from. And to date, we have been approaching urban mobility as a collection of silos. Public transportation represents one silo, privately owned vehicles represent a second silo, and on-demand mobility services, whether they're used for passenger transportation or the delivery of goods, a third silo. This approach impacts the optimizations each constituency pursues along the dimensions it chooses to focus on. It impacts how public transportation agencies allocate resources to their systems, how mobility services companies configure their virtual fleets, charge customers, and pay their drivers, and the type of and the number of vehicles OEMs produce. And as we know, most of the times from firsthand experience, one silo's optimization can negatively impact the others. For example, limiting public transportation service causes increased use of privately owned vehicles and mobility services, at least to those who can afford them. And this in turn leads to increased congestion and pollution, among other problems, resulting in a vicious cycle. So the three constituencies have been transforming in ways that will enable them to better pursue their individual objectives, but these transformations don't lead to closer to the new mobility's goals. Now, to rectify the problems created by these silos, cities must approach urban mobility as an integrated system for passenger transportation and goods delivery. The goal of such a system is to provide efficient, safe, convenient, affordable, and environmentally friendly movement of people and goods, using a combination of privately owned vehicles and services that are offered using a variety of modalities. When we start to approach urban mobility as a system and appreciate its complexity, we realize that coordination and adaptability are necessary before we can effectively utilize all the available modalities, technologies, and business models. The leadership for creating the right system must come from the city. It is the setting that is being disrupted. And because cities understand the local conditions, they are in the best position to drive the design of such a system and manage it once it is implemented. Cities like London, Singapore, Berlin, Beijing are embarking on such ambitious efforts. Experience tells us that left on their own devices, companies will optimize around only a subset of these dimensions in order to benefit their shareholder objectives, many of which may be antithetical to those of its citizens. Now, the new mobility system has four main ingredients: intelligent and highly instrumented physical and digital transportation infrastructures that incorporates the city's rules and policies, vehicles that are autonomous, connected, and electrified. The third ingredient is digital platforms that enable a wide range of applications that are used by a variety of fixed schedule and on-demand mobility services. And finally, innovative business models. Now, the system's intelligence can be found in the transportation infrastructure that processes all of the data generated by the sensors that are in these infrastructures and the vehicles, the autonomous vehicles that are part of the system, and the cloud that will enable us to manage and operate multimodal fleets and coordinate them in mobility networks. But for such a system to be built and operated effectively and efficiently, we will need to balance intelligence between the infrastructure and the vehicles. And to date, we have been placing most of the intelligence on the vehicle and some of it in the cloud. In other words, we have dumb roads and smart vehicles. It is true that in environments where autonomous vehicles must operate side by side with vehicles that have lower levels of driving automation, the autonomous vehicles must be more intelligent. But still, better balance is necessary. Now, the Michigan's CAVNY proposal provides a vision on how this intelligence can be balanced between infrastructure and vehicle, and we hope that obviously additional such proposals will come forward. As we consider these alternatives, we must determine the investments the three constituencies must make and the business models that they will help them realize the financial returns that will make these investments attractive. Implementing and deploying the new urban mobility system will be the result of a phased approach. We envision three such phases, each of which lasting several years. During the first phase, that we call the mobility services emergence phase, cities awaken to new mobility, both its advantages and disadvantages. They start considering the types of infrastructure they will need to deploy, how to monetize existing and future infrastructures, and what policies they will need to implement. Consumers start adopting app-based services for shared mobility and goods delivery. There's a growing interest in the use of autonomous vehicles, and the utility of data and AI is recognized. And obviously, in most parts of the world, we have already gone into phase one. During the second phase, the fleet formation phase, we have a pivotal transition to cities getting to the position to offer mobility as a service using intelligent networks of autonomous, connected, and electrified vehicles, or ACE vehicles, as they're often called. And during this phase, cities start deploying intelligent transportation infrastructures, partner with mobility services companies to form the integrated fleets that provide dynamically routed mobility. Examples of such emerging collaborations include those that Via Transportation has with London and Sydney, Grab's collaboration with Singapore, Comfort del Grove collaboration also with Singapore, Berlin's with a variety of mobility services providers, and Stockholm with Voi. At the same time, mobility services companies become fleet operators of autonomous connected and electric vehicles that address several different use cases for passenger transportation and goods delivery. OEMs focus on new vehicle architectures and propulsion systems while trying to establish recurring and monetizable relationships with their customers. So again, companies like Toyota, Volkswagen, GM have started down this journey. And finally, during this phase, the late consumer majority adopts the coordinated combination of fixed and dynamically scheduled mobility services. By the end of this phase, we expect to see improvements in convenience and affordability of transportation together with improvements in congestion and social equity. In the third and final stage, we will see mobility offered as a service. And during this phase, we expect cities to have transitioned to become mobility orchestrators, urban mobility networks to offer intelligent journey planning and execution, automatically determining in the process when a consumer needs to be transported to a place or when a good needs to come to the consumer. During that phase, OEMs will join these urban mobility networks, offering function-specific vehicles and certain services. And finally, the late consumer majority will adopt mobility as a service. Now, advancing through these phases will be achieved on a city-by-city basis. It will require vision, appropriate budgets, the right regulations, and perseverance, but it will also require the members of these three constituencies to transform. So let's see now what these transformations look like. In the process of developing their new urban mobility systems, cities must become mobility coordinators and eventually orchestrators. A mobility coordinator utilizes their intelligent mobility infrastructure efficiently and monetizes adequately from the entities that capitalize on its use. The best example that we have today of such a city is Singapore. In most cases, we start with what we call conventional cities. And today, unfortunately, these cities are inadequately instrumented. They have inadequately instrumented infrastructure. They have inadequate monetization of their transportation infrastructure. And they have a skill set gap in particularly in AI, data, and cybersecurity, all three of which are important in new mobility. While to become a mobility coordinator, a city needs to transform across both the technology and business model dimensions, cities that choose to proceed only to the first phase of new mobility can transform to become smart infrastructure providers or better monetizers of their existing infrastructures. So today, cities like Dubai, Copenhagen, and Helsinki fall in these categories. During the third phase of deploying the new mobility system, the cities will, with transportation coordinator status, will continue to transform to become transportation orchestrators. As such, they will be able to control and optimize the operation of all mobility resources operating in their territory and utilizing their intelligent infrastructures. The reason that the three constituencies will need to collaborate as they transform is because the transformation of one cannot be accomplished independent of the transformation undertaken by the others. Therefore, for a city's transformation to become a mobility coordinator, in order for that transformation to succeed, it needs to happen in conjunction with the transformation of mobility services companies operating in their territory to become fleet operators. As they consider these potential transformations, cities must decide how to develop their digital infrastructure in parallel to their physical infrastructure and their policies, how to partner with mobility services companies, and how to deploy and coordinate their public transportation fleets, through what models to monetize their infrastructure and what value to offer to mobility services companies, and finally, how to educate their citizens about mobility as a service. In the process, we also believe that to convince the public to use their vehicles less and even not to acquire privately owned vehicles, they must be asking what is the value of a privately owned vehicle to the individual. Maybe the individual is not thinking of the privately owned vehicle as being 95% idle, as it's often quoted in many surveys, but as 100% available. Or not only as a transportation means, but also as extra storage for child seats, athletic gear, school supplies, and other items. And if we need to increase the use of ride-sharing in cities, we need to be asking what will it take for a mobility services subscriber to be guaranteed a vehicle within 5 minutes of requesting it, and how much it will cost for that convenience to become a reality. Today, we view mobility services companies as ride coordinators that use other people's vehicles and employing transaction-based business models. Operating in their silo, many mobility services companies are undertaking transformation whose goal is to improve their economics while maintaining the level of convenience their users have been accustomed to. They are adopting additional business models, including subscriptions, delivery fees, and advertising-based monetization. Due to some of these transformations and the disappearing VC subsidies and the regulatory or social pressures to pay drivers better, certain of these services are becoming less affordable, negatively impacting their usage, even if they are becoming better monetizers of their riders. Uber is a very good example of a company that is moving in this improved monetizer category. Mobility services companies are also undertaking technology transformations and adopt sophisticated dispatching and route management systems. This helps them service the same number of customers with fewer vehicles. Grab and Didi, of the better known mobility services companies, are probably the best examples falling in this category. Even though they're largely abandoned their own internal development and of autonomous vehicles, they continue to consider such vehicles both as means to better their economics, but also for their potential to improve fleet efficiency and management. Uber and Lyft, as well as Didi, are most aggressive in this area, even though they have given up, as I said, their own autonomous vehicle efforts. To be in the position to partner with cities that are transforming to become mobility coordinators and orchestrators, mobility services companies must transform to become fleet operators. In other words, they must gain full control of their vehicles used in their service, providing a consistent rider experience in the process, and adopting the appropriate fleet management technologies and know-how, while integrating their fleets with those of the mobility coordinator cities. Jointly with these cities, they will also need to determine how to share their digital infrastructures and data. Via Transportation has been the most successful in this area, in our opinion, whereas Comfort Del Grow, a company we're working with, has launched an impressive effort in 3 of the cities where they operate, starting with Singapore. As part of this transformation, they will need to collaborate with the cities to jointly determine the impact of city structure, population density, regulations, public transportation network, infrastructure, and other urban characteristics on the composition, operation, and management of these hybrid fleets. What is appropriate in Manhattan may not be appropriate in Berlin. Now, as they enter the second phase of new urban mobility, these companies, particularly the ones involved in passenger transportation, are realizing that despite their investments, they will only become regional market leaders. This realization impacts their decision on which cities to collaborate with, what services to offer in general, and what investments to make within these cities. Ride-hailing and ride-sharing services saw their growth during the pandemic was due to their exploding adoption of e-commerce. Today, consumer ridership remains rather stalled, even if it is better than it was in the depths of the pandemic, because many people now work from home or because they fly less for business. These companies will need to make some hard decisions regarding the business models that they will drive their future success, and transactions such as the acquisition of Postmates by Uber will not be the exception. The issue of whether to treat drivers as employees or contractors will not disappear. As drivers expect better allocation of each fare, the operations of mobility services companies will be impacted even in cities where they choose to operate as ride coordinators. Therefore, their decision of how to treat drivers will further impact their ability to collaborate with mobility orchestrator cities. I had originally envisioned, when I was writing the transportation transformation book, that OEMs will transform and be in the position to actively partner with cities during the second phase of developing and deploying this new urban mobility system. I now expect that during this phase, OEMs will continue to operate in their silo. Their technology transformations will center on vehicles, while their business transformations will center on establishing direct and recurring customer relations. Within this space, I expect most OEMs will transform along the technology dimension to focus on providing vehicles with improved safety features and reduced emissions. This will require them to increasingly adopt new vehicle architectures that rely on data and AI technologies. In the process, they will also have to decide the geographies where they will operate and how they will operate in these geographies. So Tesla, Volkswagen, Toyota, and Hyundai have launched impressive efforts in this area. As they begin to appreciate the importance of owning the customer relationship, the OEMs transform along the business dimension by adopting recurring revenue models such as vehicle subscriptions. They also start offering a variety of services, including vehicle, driver, and passenger-centric services that may create conflicts with their established dealer networks. GM and Volkswagen are following on Tesla's example in this area. At best, during the second phase, a few OEMs will appreciate the importance of fleet-based mobility and start by treating their park as a fleet that needs to be managed uniformly. These OEMs will need to adopt fleet management and operation technologies and know-how, again, requiring them to improve their data and AI skills. This transformation, if undertaken, will enable them to be part of the intelligent mobility networks that will emerge during the third phase that I mentioned. Tesla and Lucid Motors lead in this way, in my opinion, and both in thinking and execution, and several other OEMs are starting down this path. However, their efforts will be more evident in the next 3 to 4 years and not before. Even without partnering with cities or competing with mobility services companies, OEM must make several critical decisions. In particular, they must determine whether they will provide the entire mobility platform from the new vehicle architecture and associated applications to the ownership and exploitation of data. This will enable them to own the complete customer relationship. A second alternative for them will to offer parts of the vehicle architecture and be responsible for the movement of data, but not own much of it. This will enable them to own only part of the customer relationship. And the final alternative for them will be to be only manufacturers of vehicles along with some systems integration capabilities. And this will enable them to take full advantage of their manufacturing know-how and capacity, but will not give them the opportunity to own any part of the customer relationship. In other words, and to use an analogy from smartphones, they will need to determine whether they want to be Apple, AT&T, or Foxconn. They will also need to decide what business models to adopt and what impact these models will have on their customers, their dealer relations, but also their production volume. And finally, they need to recalibrate their relationships with their manufacturing employees as the production volume decreases and automation increases, since the software-defined vehicle will require fewer parts. Let's switch now to thinking about mobility, the new mobility value chains. Now, with the constituencies transforming so that they can operate in the new mobility system with the city as the orchestrator, new opportunities arise for a variety of industries. For example, members of the financial services industry are becoming involved by providing frictionless payments technology to emerging driver commerce applications. ComfortDelGro, for example, is partnering with DBS, a bank in Singapore, and Didi is partnering with Alipay. Many of these industries will be participating in mobility for the first time. Now, because the participants in these emerging value chains include many startups, venture investors are particularly aggressively engaged in funding them. Due to the characteristics of the services and the vehicles that are part of new mobility, value creation is shifting from incumbents, for example, incumbent automatic suppliers, to a new set of partners. Over the next 10 years, we expect to see a large number of M&A transactions that will enable today's incumbents to remain relevant in the emerging new mobility ecosystem. With ground mobility being reimagined, in addition to the emergence of new value chains, we expect to also see changes in the existing value chains used by OEMs and mobility services companies due to the transformations they undertake. Dictated by changes in vehicle platforms, the automakers' existing value chain will change. The relatively monolithic life cycle that dominated vehicle introductions over the past 70 or so years would be replaced by three separate life cycles relating to the vehicle's software content, its hardware components, and its chassis and body. Chassis and body will change less frequently than in the past, as we're already seeing with Tesla's Model S. But in the software-defined vehicle, software and certain types of hardware could be updated as frequently as every 12 to 18 months, aligning with the technology industry's life cycle. This will create problems for vehicle certification and recertification. We're seeing two different models emerging in this area. On the one hand, we have the vertically integrated models, such as those being pursued by GM and Tesla, but are also intrigued by the partnerships that Aptiv and Mobileye are establishing with various automakers, particularly Hyundai and BMW. Because of the automakers' emerging goal to establish a more direct and ongoing relationship with the consumer and the fleet operator, we expect increasing focus on post-sale services. Obviously, Tesla has shown the power of this model, and we expect GM's OnStar will also receive renewed attention. Many of these services, however, will be offered through new partner ecosystems rather than just the OEM. We also expect that such models will extend to new mobility's third phase as some vehicle developments start mobility services and enter the transportation network developed by certain cities. GM will be doing this with Cruise. Tesla will most likely do it with vehicles that are used in a Tesla-owned mobility service, and Ford will do it with Argo. For the autonomous delivery vehicles they are developing, Amazon and Nuro will need to partner with vehicle contract manufacturers before they can scale. Similarly, as the result of additional operations due to transformations they undertake, for example, ride coordinators becoming better monetizers by adding goods delivery, as Uber is doing, and the regulations that they need to adhere to, the ride coordinators in particular will see their existing value chains being altered as well. Many of the components that will be added to this value chain will be provided by new partners. New value chains will initially emerge during the second phase of new mobility. This will be the result of cities becoming mobility coordinators and mobility services becoming fleet operators in these cities. These value chains will include many new operations. For example, Via's value chain includes Shell for vehicle charging and Curb for linking to ride-hailing providers. In the area of fleet management, Via had partnered with Fleetonomy, an Israeli startup that it eventually acquired. Grab's value chain, similarly, includes Split in the area of reservations. Even in the case of cities that are part of their public transportation fleets that are incorporated into the fleets of mobility services companies, The vehicle types that will be part of the integrated fleets, they will utilize AI approaches, and they will need to, for these operations to be rethought. Operations such as transportation planning and vehicle acquisition that today may be used independently by each of the constituencies will need to be properly integrated so that the city can function as mobility orchestrator. For example, via partner with Remix that was helping cities in new mobility planning. Eventually, it acquired the company. Our own portfolio company, Stipple, is helping transportation authorities with analyses that help them incorporate new modalities into their urban mobility systems, including services that utilize autonomous vehicles. The new urban mobility will also create new forms of value and value exchange models, as I mentioned. Data and loyalty patterns will emerge as two new important forms of value. In mobility, related data is important because of its variety. It will come from the infrastructure, the vehicle and supply chain, the occupants of the vehicle and the fleets. Its value will be realized through several applications that exploit it, such as fleet management and predictive diagnosis, particularly as it will soon be possible to access the genealogy of each vehicle's components. Data also will play a central role in the monetization of the infrastructure, but also in the effort of many industries to better understand and monetize consumer mobility, from automakers to travel and hospitality companies, and even retailers and consumer packaged good companies. Data will lead to the establishment of new ecosystems and further enhance the opportunity for recurring relations between enterprises and their customers. For example, ComfortDelGro is partnering with retailer Lazada for this very reason. Loyalty will emerge as another important form of value. It will have to be tested constantly through the various mobility touchpoints. Due to its importance, we will need to develop new ways of measuring it and identify actions that meaningfully impact it. For the automaker, this will be a new approach to loyalty. Automakers will need to move from the concept of brand loyalty that is measured by the purchase or leasing of a vehicle every few years to testing loyalty continuously through various services that they will need to introduce. As the importance of loyalty is established, companies that participate in new mobility will develop their own walled gardens, as Google, Apple, and Amazon have done and are now extending to mobility. Before they can take full advantage of the data generated under new mobility and the many rich data flows that are established among the members of the new value chains, the various participants of this system will need to accept that a single party will not own all of the data, though many will try. All data, as data is accumulated, fused, and exchanged, it will need to be properly protected. Mobility companies will need to be involved in the same type of privacy discussions we currently associate with the advertising and e-commerce industries. Companies that collect and utilize this data will become equally important targets as financial services, telcos, and other organizations are today because of the data that they will need to collect and own. The data's value will be set through usage by the market. And over the past 20 years, we have seen this principle play out both in the online advertising and e-commerce industries. The mobility industry will need to learn its lessons from these experiences. Now, as mobility's phases unfold, the ingredients used, the transformations undertaken by the three constituencies, and the degree in which they decide to collaborate on a city-by-city basis will determine how the new mobility system will be implemented in each city. We foresee three possible scenarios. Under the first scenario, we see continuous reliance on privately owned vehicles. Mobility services adoption will move from the early to the late majority in several cities. Silos will break down in a few cities, but even there, not completely. Social divisions, large and growing penetration of privately owned vehicles, discordant regulation, lower emphasis on funding transportation infrastructure and public transportation contribute to this scenario. The cities that belong in this scenario will never move beyond the first phase of new mobility. Under the second scenario, we envision the acceleration of private and public partnerships with the increasing development of multimodal networks comprising of assets from both mobility services companies and public transportation services. Some of these networks will use autonomous vehicles, but not all. As cities get reconfigured, privately owned vehicles will coexist with these networks, but will be restricted from certain urban areas. We envision European cities as good candidates for this scenario. They have the right structure to continue supporting multimodal public transportation. There's a strong emphasis on urban transportation investments, and they have shown they can augment their public systems with private fleets. These cities will comfortably complete phase 2 and enter phase 3, giving them the ability to offer their citizens mobility as a service in certain regions. Finally, under the third scenario, we see the creation of many more private-public partnerships, which together with central government investment, they will create transformations that will enable them to quickly move from phase 2 to phase 3. As a result, orchestrated advanced mobility networks will be deployed in new and retrofitted smart cities to offer mobility as a service. Autonomous vehicles will be used extensively, and privately owned vehicles will be highly regulated in certain urban areas. We see strong interest in this scenario by Asian countries, led by China and Singapore, but followed closely by Japan and Korea. The value chains and the types of value that will be adopted in exchange will depend on how each of these scenarios unfold. New urban mobility requires city leadership and systems thinking by cities, automakers, and mobility services companies. As they collaborate, these constituencies will need to transform. The transformations they undertake and their ability to adapt will determine the roles in each urban mobility system that is being created. Now, the transformed mobility will lead to existing value chains to be altered and to new value chains with new forms of value to emerge. Despite the challenges that we have been facing over the past 18 months, this is a great time to intensify our efforts to reimagine urban mobility and set off to implement our plans. In the process, challenging our notions of government involvement, social equity to transportation, and to the environment. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation, Dr. Simoudis. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Calvin Tuttle, and I serve as the Marketing Communications Specialist for CCAT. The remainder of our time is going to be spent taking questions from all of you. So if you have any for Dr. Simoudis, please enter them in the Q&A or chat box on Zoom and the chat box on YouTube. So our first question comes from Dr. Liu. The question is, the current transportation infrastructure owners and operators are government agencies. Do you think in the future there will be an intelligent transportation data service provider business sector that will provide the needed services for connected and automated vehicles?
Well, we see a number of companies, first of all, emerging in the area of as data consolidators and normalizers, analyzers for this, to provide this kind of data-driven services to both government agencies and to corporations. I want to note, most recently, Wedjo out of the UK has partnered with Microsoft and Palantir in order to start putting in place such a capability. We've been talking to a number of both cities and to OEMs and mobility services companies about what should be their data strategies. I think the cities, particularly here in the US, are farthest behind in this effort, but also OEMs are not in the best possible position. We see the mobility services companies, many of which have data-driven pedigree from their startup roots, as being in the best position to capitalize on the data that they can collect. But again, even in their case, they do not collect all the data that is possible to be collected and be utilized in a new mobility system.
Excellent. Thank you. So our next question is kind of important, especially right now with the FCC reallocation of the safety spectrum. So we have a question from the audience that's asking for you to kind of touch on the importance of 5G with all of this.
So we've recently done a couple of analyses for OEMs that are very interested in understanding both how data will flow from the vehicle to the cloud, and what need to be the intermediate stops essentially of that data, and what will be the communication channels. Just going on 5G and dealing with all the data that can be collected is going to be prohibitively expensive. So it's not only an issue of spectrum, but it's also an issue of cost. So this is why in one of the points that I tried to make in the presentation is that we need to start balancing intelligence a lot better than we are doing today. We need to be collecting certain amount of data and doing certain amount of processing in the vehicle, certain amount of filtering in the vehicle, but the same things need to be happening at the infrastructure at various points in the infrastructure, the so-called fog. So 5G will help, but it cannot be the only channel through which data flows from the vehicle to the cloud.
Sure. Thank you. So the next question from the audience is Zig the pseudo MOS app, which CDG came up with recently, included in your partnership with them?
So we have been talking to CDG and to other companies about what are the applications that they will need to start thinking about and developing in order to increase their the connection with the consumer. And in the process, we will need to be determining, all of these constituencies need to be determining where these applications need to reside. If they reside strictly on the smart device, then there is a potential of losing that relationship, losing that connection, and the strength of that connection between, let's say, OEM and consumer. So the advice that we're providing is that yes, it needs to start from the smart device, a smartphone, tablet, but it needs to have a seamless transition to the car, to the vehicle, taking full advantage of the vehicle's capabilities, not only of the vehicle's ability to mirror the smart device. Because if it's just an issue of mirroring, then the owner still remains Google, Apple, companies like that. So the whether it is the developers of IVI infotainment systems or the new infotainment systems, in other words, whether it is the incumbent developers of infotainment systems or creators of new infotainment systems, will need to take that into account. We've been involved, our firm has been involved in a few efforts to rethink the cabin and to determine how the data that is produced in the cabin can be used to enhance this relationship between consumer and vehicle owner, vehicle operator, vehicle owner to an OEM in order to move forward.
Sure. Thank you. So we have a comment and a question from somebody in the audience. They say, thank you for a great and inspiring presentation. Things will be more connected and interdisciplinary. What would be your thoughts about necessary changes in education programs for the future vehicle and transportation system engineers?
It's very, I'm not that involved with education, so, but I will say that the public in general, and this is why I made one quick comment during the presentation, the public in general needs to be better educated on the importance of multimodality. Now it helps when from the beginning you start using public transportation and you're not always jumping in your privately owned vehicle. So that's why I said that under the scenarios that we have explored, both in writing the book, but also more recently as part of our firm, we are in areas where you have very high ownership of privately owned vehicles. We're seeing more difficulty in adopting this multimodal coordination, system-wide efforts. But so I think it's not only an education of kind of at the university level in terms of what kind of systems we should be building. And I've said in certain universities that I'm affiliated with that the reason is as much systems thinking in their education as it should be. We tend to very quickly specialize at component thinking as opposed to systems thinking. But if you want to see it more from a society perspective, I think the education needs to start way before. People need to appreciate and understand how to capitalize on multiple modalities, simultaneous capitalization of multiple modalities as they move in urban environments in particular.
Excellent. Thank you for your insight. Our next audience member is interested on your thoughts on how social sciences, for example, behavioral psychology, can be applied to facilitate progress in the real world. Sorry.
I'm sorry, I have not thought about this. I guess the best way to answer it is to be able to show in important ways what are the advantages that each of these, let's say, each of these three phases that I talked about, on a city by city basis, what are the advantages to the individual, and how the advantages continue to be accentuated by the city as a way of bringing additional audience, additional citizens into the system. I don't think that we have done a very good job in that area in particular. I mean, around the world, I think probably Singapore and maybe Dubai have done the most aggressive efforts in these areas, but we need to do a lot more.
Sure, absolutely. So we have another question focused on the U.S. So to catalyze this kind of movement in this direction in the U.S., where would you begin to create some of that momentum?
I would start actually. I was very encouraged, I should say, by what Columbus was trying to do, and I was very disappointed. In fact, when I was doing the research for the book, I spent a lot of time looking into that, and then I was in the intervening period. I was very disappointed to see how many of those initiatives that Columbus had undertaken were not brought to full fruition. I was similarly dismayed, by the way, by what had happened in Toronto between the collaboration of the city and sidewalk labs. So to me, this is how we need to, especially here in North America, this is how we need to start from. We need to start from kind of smaller, either smaller regions of large cities or smaller cities. One other thing, by the way, that I should mention about Columbus, which was extremely encouraging to me, was that it's not only the city that was designing and instituting all these programs around coordinated mobility that also involved autonomous vehicles, but one of the taxi companies in the city had undertaken a very important transformation to make it much more competitive to on-demand mobility services companies. And in this way brings forward, actually it's still going on, the fleet management, data-driven decisioning, making them much closer to what we've seen in companies like Comfort and Grow. But I think that's the right level of city here in the US that needs to, where this type of transformation needs to start from.
Great. I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. This one came prior to the event. Someone was curious how different organizations are dealing with data that has been contaminated since the COVID-19 pandemic.
I'm sorry, contaminated meaning that it's not reliable?
That's what I interpret that question to mean, yes.
So what we are seeing, and again, what we are involved in, is really establishing, in fact, just completed recently a couple of studies like this where we're looking at 3 periods, if you will, for US organizations. We're looking at the pre-pandemic period, the pandemic period, a period from between, let's say, February of 2020 to March 2021 or so, March, and then the more recent period. And we're finding that we need to be establishing new baselines, and these baselines are very much city dependent or environment dependent. So we cannot say that the baseline that we established for the Bay Area will be exactly the same baseline that we will see in another US city of the same size, even if you were to take, let's say, the 10 largest US cities. So, but it is important to look at the data in these 3 periods because there are some interesting, as I was saying in the beginning of my talk, what we have seen during the pandemic period is not only the change of mobility, right? In other words, people using, let's say, public transport, they move less, regardless of the modality that they use. But some of it, if you look at changes in mobility with changes in real estate, with relocation, you come to understand that some of these changes will be more permanent than we would have thought under a different scenario, right? Let's say under a flood or something like that. So we've been splitting our analysis in these 3 different areas and trying to determine what will be trying to predict and determine what are going to be the new baselines that will be established, especially as I said, in regions of interest post-pandemic, whatever we consider now the post-pandemic period.